Shalom, brothers and sisters. I'm making this video to clear up the confusion. I'm sure people are saying, what do we do now? One thing I think Jerry and we didn't quite understand is the equinoxes. I'm going to take the blame for this. I know the confusion is the equinoxes and not separating the solar cycle from the calendar. Just to set the record straight, the calendar is 364 days only. From a calendar year to year, not a solar cycle. Please try to separate the two, just like people were confused by not separating the priestly order from the calendar. These are the three layers stacked upon each other. Back to our equinox videos. Starting in 2016, in March of 2013, when we had no sundials, we kept Aviv 1, March 27th. We counted 364 days, count 1, and we are correct. The calendar has been correct since 2013. If you look at this picture here that we took of our sundial and filmed March 21st, 2016 on Monday, which the equinox occurred March 19th, if you look at the string line. Sundial shows it was 2 days earlier than the day it was filmed. We filmed on March 21st, 2017 on Tuesday in this picture shown above. The equinox occurred March 20th on a Monday. Sundial shows it was the day before on Monday. So 2016 was a 366-day year according to the solar cycle, not the calendar. With this filmed March 19th, 2018 on Monday, equinox occurred March 20th on a Tuesday. Sundial shows it was filmed 1 day early, and the equinox would be the next day on Tuesday. Looking at this picture above, which was filmed on March 20th, 2019 on Wednesday. The equinox occurred on March 20th on a Wednesday. Sundial shows it was on Wednesday. So next year, in 2020, the vernal equinox will occur on Thursday. The one thing that we haven't realized, and going back and looking at our own dials, and looking at other people's dials across the world, their equinoxes are moving a day forward and progressing each year. We've made mistakes on our equinoxes, on declaring an equinox on a day that it's not on the line. Our mistake. But we have had the calendar correct since 2013 because we always begin on the first Wednesday after the equinox occurred. Because in 2013 we kept March 27th Wednesday as Aviv 1. So the equinox always occurred before Aviv 1 since 2013. This 364-day biblical calendar is not the same as the literal solar cycle. After a 7-day intercalation, the calendar will work perfectly as 364 days. And the next day, Wednesday, is Aviv 1, which is what Jerry said and I said. And that is correct. 364, count 1 each year. Until the vernal equinox passes that 364th day, which it did this year. So Aviv 1 must begin on March 27th again, like it was in 2013. I've got Asherid sitting here with me this evening. We've been going through a lot of stuff on some of the mistakes that we have made as far as the equinoxes, not separating it from the solar cycle. I understand our mistakes, and I just want to be honest with each and every one of you on declaring an equinox on a day that it's not an equinox. And I know we all knew that Tuesday, that it had to begin the next day on a Wednesday. And that is true. It will begin on a Wednesday. I'm going to let Asherid go ahead and take over at this point to go ahead and share some charts with you that I have looked at and realized a lot of the confusion that I still had in my head that I've had to really deal with. It's been frustrating for me, and I know it's been frustrating for many others. But I know as long as we keep helping each other get through the frustrations and encourage one another and not put each other down, that we'll come through this and we'll come through it together. and we're here to help each other. And I don't look at anybody when they make mistakes. There's many out there that's got really discouraged because they're going through a lot of confusion and stuff. And I've been through a lot of confusion in my mind too, trying to figure all this stuff out. But every piece of the puzzle comes together as we go further, and it's all on Yah's timing. He's going to do what he wants to do when he wants to do it, not when we want it. Okay, Asherik, go ahead and share some things that we've sat down and discussed. I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor and let you do what you've got. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Shalom, everybody. Asherit here from the Asherit Dead Sea Scrolls YouTube channel. This may actually be a little bit of a rehash for some of you that have watched the entire Zadok Calendar Dead Sea Scrolls series on my YouTube channel. But for those that are not familiar with those studies, I'm going to try to just give you a really quick condensed version. Basically, we're going to start with understanding that time requires motion. Without motion, without forward movement, the concept of time doesn't exist. So all of the luminary cycles progress forward in time. The stars progress forward, the sun progresses forward, and the moon also moves forward. Just like we all age and progress forward in years, so does time. And without this forward motion, this forward progression, we wouldn't have something that we understand, this concept that we know of as time. So Enoch states that the sign must occur before Abib 1 or by the end of the 364th day. So when the equinox goes past that 364th day, some form of intercalation is required to begin Abib 1, always on Wednesday and always within the fourth gate. Now, if you look at this slide here, I have Abib 1 for 2019, 2020, and 2021. As Lee already mentioned, this calendar began with Lee and Jerry in 2013 on March 27th because 2012 was just like 2018. And in 2013, the equinox occurred on a Wednesday. They actually added 7 days and began that year on the 27th of March. This is what this calendar shows happening again in 2019. We add those 7 days when the equinox passed that 364th day on the Zadok calendar. So if you look at this year, 2019, and you can see it again in 2020 and 2021 right next to it in the columns, that without the 31st day, the season of summer would shift back to begin on Tuesday. Then the season of fall would also shift back and begin on a Monday. And then the season of winter would shift back and begin on Sunday. So that at the end of the year, the next spring would shift back to begin on a Saturday. This is not allowed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they're very clear that the year Abib 1 must begin on a Wednesday, the fourth day of the week. This is why the 4 days are called seasonal change days or the 31st days, which occur during the year. They must be counted within the year. Because if you look at this chart, you will see what happens when there's no intercalation. You can see those first days of spring, the renewal of each season, those renewal days, the first day of spring falling back. It's receding back further and further and further without a 31st day. So those are the 4 intercalary days, which are added up at the end of the 360-day stellar cycle, leading up to Abib 1 occurring again on a Wednesday. As Enoch says, that these seasonal change days truly perform their service in their world stations each year, which is true based on the charts that we were just looking at. So let's read about chapter 72. So Enoch says in chapter 72 that the year begins in the fourth gate. That cannot happen until the equinox has completed its cycle through the third gate, with the moon setting through the same gate on the night of the equinox. Then the sun rises on the day following the equinox in the fourth gate. And we read in chapter 72, verses 4 through 6. And first there goes forth the great luminary named the sun, and his circumference is like the circumference of the heaven, and he is quite filled with illuminating and heating fire. The chariot on which he ascends, the wind drives, and the sun goes down from the heaven and returns through the north in order to reach the east, and is so guided that he comes to the appropriate portal and shines in the face of the heaven. In this way he rises in the first month in the great portal, which is the fourth of the 6 portals in the east. So notice that the sun must rise in the fourth portal before the year begins. But also notice there's no mention of the equinox occurring the prior day. We only know that the equinox is past because here he tells us that the sun is rising in the fourth gate on the first day of spring, or the first day of the next year in this 1-year cycle. Now, at the end of the year, this is what Enoch says. And on that day, the sun rises from that portal and sets in the west and returns to the east, and rises in the third portal for 130 mornings and sets in the west of heaven. On that day, the night decreases and amounts to 9 parts, and the day to 9 parts, and the night is equal to the day, and the year is exactly as to its days, 364. And the length of the day and of the night, and the shortness of the days and of the night arise through the course of the sun. These distinctions are made, or literally they are separated. That's again in Enoch 72, 31 through 33. So note that Enoch only gives us a 1-year cycle, but this is a distinct pattern, which we can match with the solar cycles of 2001, 2007, 2012, 2018, and we'll see it again in 2024, 2029, and 2035, because the solar cycle is a calculable cycle. We know what it's going to do. It does it on a steady and a very regular basis. Also note that Enoch specifically does not state when the vernal equinox occurred at the start of the 1-year cycle that he gives us. I believe that many people are assuming that the equinox was on the same day, the 364th day, and had to have occurred before Abib 1, the day prior. But Enoch never says that. He is careful to only say that the year began within the fourth gate. Now, Enoch begins chapter 74 on the lunar cycle, specifically focusing on the movement of the moon during the transition periods within the 2 gates of the equinox months. That's gate 3 and gate 4 for each year. Again, Enoch is giving us a specific 1-year pattern rather than a yearly pattern of lunar cycles, as the phases of the moon can occur in any phase within these 2 middle gates. I believe that the main point is that regardless of the lunar phases, the moon will rise and set during the equinox within those 2 gates, which is what we showed in the video of the sun setting on the night of the equinox and the moon setting also on the night of the equinox. If you regularly watch the sunsets and the moon sets in the morning, like some crazy people do, like myself, you'll realize that for the sun and the moon to be setting in the same gate is not a normal occurrence. The moon is very erratic, and it jumps from one gate to another, and it crosses the sky It doesn't do anything very consistently. So at the end of the chapter, Enoch shows us the difference between the lunar and the solar cycles. He says in verse 13, in 3 years there are 1,092 days, and in 5 years 1,820 days, so that in 8 years there are 2,912 days. For the moon alone, the days amount in 3 years to 1,062 days, and in 5 years she falls behind 50 days. And in 5 years there are 1,770 days, so that for the moon the days in 8 years amount to 2,932 days. For in 8 years she falls behind to the amount of 80 days. All the days she falls behind in 8 years are 80. Okay, so what is the moon falling behind by 30 days in 3 years, 50 days in 5 years, and 80 days in 8 years? She's falling behind that 1 year lunar cycle that he provided on the equinox. He's not telling us in 3 years the moon's going to show back up again. He's telling us in 3 years that lunar cycle from that 1 year is now going to occur 30 days before the equinox. And in 5 years, that lunar cycle that he recorded is going to occur 50 days before the equinox. And that same lunar cycle is going to occur 80 days before the equinox in 8 years. So we see that once again, Enoch begins with a 1 year solar equinox pattern with a specific lunar phase. Then he tells us that in 5 years, that same lunar phase is 50 days before the equinox occurs. So Enoch is not tracking where the moon appears at the equinox in years 3, 5, and 8 around the equinox. But he is literally showing us that the lunar phase of 1 year is steadily receding further and further from the equinox each subsequent year. Now, you can continue with the same calculations to see that at the end of 12 years, the lunar phase should be 120 days before the vernal equinox, that same moon that he was looking at in year 1. And in 24 years, that same phase should occur around 240 days before the equinox. And in 36 years, that lunar phase should return to the vernal equinox once again. If it's a calculable cycle that's precise and has precision in it, then that is what you should see. However, it does not, because the moon is not precise like the solar equinoxes. It actually requires 2 additional years for that lunar phase to match back up with the solar cycle given in that starting year. This is because the moon is on a 19-year cycle called the Metonic cycle. So it's actually 19 years and 11 days, and even that is not precise. It still shifts even around those 11 days. So we have 2 separate cycles which overlap one another around every 38 years or so, but again, not precisely. So it's like the 6-year priestly cycle and the 7-year Shemitah cycle years, which overlap but require 42 years before they occur simultaneously again. 42 years before you have a Shemitah year, which is also the first year of the priestly cycle beginning with Gamal. I believe that a lot of people are reading these verses and looking for the lunar phases 3 years later to line up with the vernal equinox. But I don't believe that that is Enoch's point. I believe that what he's telling us is how far the phases have receded from the vernal equinox in the 1 year that he provided as an example. The bottom line, I believe, is that Enoch's point is that the lunar phases cannot be used to determine the solar calendar because the lunar cycle is peculiar in his words and erratic in mine. A 19-year Metonic cycle cannot be evenly divided by either the 3, 5, or the 8-year cycles which Enoch provides. Again, this should highlight the erratic nature of the lunar phases rather than trying to establish a comparison with the vernal equinoxes every 3 years or 6 years or 7 years or even 8 years, because that is not what Enoch himself does or even seems to be promoting in that chapter. I believe that Enoch's point is the setting of the moon in the west during the transitional portals with the sun, that's gates 3 and 4, 2 months a year, regardless of the lunar phase, is his emphasis. So again, this is a very short recap. I'm not going into a great deal of depth on this subject because I've already done that in my other videos, my Zadok calendar and the Dead Sea Scroll video series. But I do want to point out again that the solar year is 365 days, but the biblical year is 364 days, just like Lee said, just like Jerry said. This requires a 7-day intercalation to keep the start of the year within the 4th gate and on a Wednesday, which is what happened in 2013 when the equinox was on the 20th and Abib 1 began on March 27th. This is why we have not had to concern ourselves for the past 6 years about where the equinox was. We could just continue 364 count 1, 364 count 1 year after year until this year when the equinox passed that 364th day, just like it did in 2013. Also, we do not believe that the moon was ever intended by Enoch or the Zadok priests in the Dead Sea Scrolls to be used to intercalate a solar calendar or establish years or Abib 1 based on a lunar cycle. The sun is a self-contained cycle. It does all of those things on its own without any help from the moon or the stars. The solar cycle is the plumb line that the moon and the stars require in order to establish a year. But the solar cycle doesn't need the stars or the moon to determine years. Rachel Elior points out in her excellent book, and it's a really good book. If you guys haven't read it, I really highly recommend that you go out and get it. It's called The Three Temples, and read it cover to cover. It's a very good book, an analysis on the Dead Sea Scrolls. She's a native-born Israeli, and her field of specialty is ancient Hebrew texts. That's her entire focus of research. In the Three Temples, Rachel Elior makes the statement that Jubilees in the Qumranic version says that the Great Light was appointed for establishing the biblical calendar. If you have a copy of Jubilees, pick it up and turn to chapter 2, verse 9. In verse 9 it says, "And Yah appointed the sun to be a great sign on the earth for days and for Shabbats and for months and for feasts and for years and for Shabbats of years," the Shemitah years, "and for Jubilees and for all seasons of the years." Now the prior verse tells us that the sun, the moon, and the stars were all appointed to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. But the great light, it specifically states, the sun establishes the signs, the seasons, the days, and the years, which is also what we read when we look at Genesis 1:14 in the Hebrew, and it tells us that the great luminary is set in the firmament to be for signs, to be for days, to be for seasons, and to be for years. And it was so. It's not until the next verse, in verse 15, that we see what perhaps may be the moon being created. So there is some dispute that might actually be speaking of the stars, specifically when you look at it in the Paleo-Hebrew and take out all of the added words that the English translators put into the text. However, that's a debate for an entirely different day. As I said before, this is just a quick recap. I go into much more depth in Zadok calendar studies in the Dead Sea Scrolls part 3, 4, and 5 on my personal YouTube channel, Asherit Dead Sea Scrolls. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Lee because I'm sure he has some closing remarks. Thank you for your time, and shalom.
Okay, the whole point of the statement that I've made this evening is to point out some of the mistakes that we've made. Our dials have been perfect every year. And if you go back and look at those dials and others, you'll see that the equinox progresses day by day. We're moving forward. My question is, when the equinox occurs after the 364th day, what will you do? Because that's what has happened this year. This is where we're at this point. Shalom.